So these are three very, very provocative interventions. We have about half an hour or 35 minutes before the break. I want to pose a couple of questions that came out of each of your talks and get you perhaps to talk a bit between you, and then time permitting we'll open it up to some individual questions from the floor. So the first question is the question about city, and it's interesting how the conversation and perhaps the title of the event itself sort of prompted this. The conversation was around, and Vinay sort of urged us to draw the distinction between cities and the urban yesterday. And today the conversation, the very word, the urban, I don't think was used once in any of the three presentations, interestingly enough. It was all about cities, right? So I don't know what that means, but I'll put it out there on the table. So in terms of the question of city decay and renewal or surging, resurgence, as Achille put it, I want to pose a question. What is the relation of decay and resurgence to the question of decadence, which has come up previously in the week? What are the logics of the relations between the two? What is the logic of the relation, for example, of the relations between, Achille mentioned walls, right, as a condition of our time in all sorts of places. Wendy Brown has been writing very interestingly of late about walls and walls as the structures of the neoliberal condition. Right? What is the logic of the relation of, what is the logic of walls to the logic of conviviality, about which, say, Gilroy has written, among others? And indeed, what is the relation of the one to the other? How are they mutually implicated in some sense? So that's one set of questions, is a question around decay and renewal and their co-constitution. A second set of questions, which I think the talks brought out, is how is the city represented and indeed representing itself? How are these representations and their so-called underlying lived conditions at a difference from those of other cities? Where do they map each other, and where do those maps diverge quite dramatically from each other? We were struck last night that Achille, Sarah and I and Anil were walking around to a supermarket at about 11 o'clock at night, and the relation between the similar of cities, right? Starbucks and the same kinds of shops that you see and so on down the Y High Street. And, you know, when you turn the corner, not half a block away, there are people sitting on the sidewalk, playing mahjong or fixing scooters and so on, you know, not 10 meters off the main shopping street of a very major city in this country. So that relation between the very lived condition of the street itself and the globalized same that gets repeated across various cities today. And then the third, and perhaps this is in some ways related to the other two, and I think back to Sarah's talk over here about the surface and the underneath of cities. What is the relation indeed between, in some sense, surging and decaying or even decadent cities on the one hand, and cities in which an increasingly significant proportion of the global population, not to belittle it, is living in something like refugee camps, which have quickly become cities, and the relation between surface and underneath, right, that produces those sets of lived conditions. You think of all kinds of places around the world, and indeed the relation between cities as they constituted in the, I would say, predominant imaginary, and the shadow cities that are produced no longer simply around their edges, but sometimes at their very heart. You think of slum cities, for example, or shanty towns, and so on and so forth. What is the relation of the lived condition? What is the lived condition of cities in the relation between their so-called dominant orders and their shadow conditions? And one last small question, this is really for Leo Lee. I'm not sure if this was just a kind of fairly flip passing, but at one point he spoke of Hong Kong as island and empire, and I wondered if those aren't dramatically different analytics, actually. The one analytic very self-contained, in a way largely lacking relation, and the other constituted through relationality and historicity and those flows that the panelists have spoken about.
Well, I use this quote, Empire of Science, you know, of course, Roland Barthes talked about Japan, actually, I borrowed that to Hong Kong. But I think Akbar was the one who raised the question. I remember reading his book, is Decadence, right? Decadence, which I think presents a kind of a Benjaminian paradox in itself. I consider decadence to be a paradoxical state in which supermodernity has imposed itself. So the more supermodern a city becomes, the more decadent it looks, at least in some parts of the city. Another way of defining decadence would be to see the mismatch or the protrusion of certain traces of a sterile history onto a modern surface. For instance, Venice is everybody's favorite city of decadence, because everywhere you have sort of a torn walls, you know, sort of off-colored walls, which affords a kind of aesthetic beauty. But of course, the whole city of Venice is for tourists. The entire wealth of present-day Venice is dependent on its tourist economy, and nothing else, it seems to me. So that's the extreme case. So in that case, it's very hard to put Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is always somewhere in between, it seems to me, and so is Shanghai. But what is missing in this whole conversation, if we were to have a colleague from China, is again, the sort of shadow of the nation, of the new nation state. China now defines itself as really as a powerful nation state, first of all, and secondly, a post-socialist state. I think most people just pay lip service to socialism or whatever, officially. Nobody believes in it anymore. But when you talk about nationalism, yes, definitely. Almost kind of a uniform voice now from the government. But that presents tremendous problem to our critical vocabulary and reflection. So I'm just still thinking about some of the questions that David has raised. Maybe others can join in, and then we can have another round.
Yeah, very briefly, because I'm keen to hear what you think. I think that there's a reason for invoking cityness rather than the urban, because part of the project for people working on cities in the South is to extract them from their confinement in discourses of urbanization, something to do with what I was saying, as cities constructed as problems and not as ideas. So I think that invoking cityness has a kind of pejorative meaning in some respects, at least for me, rather than urbanization, and so on. The second thing is walls. I think the most interesting question for me that David raised was walls, and how would you think walls in relation to conviviality? So the one thing is to say that don't take walls always at face value. It's been found that in South African townships, Soweto in particular, people build big walls because they're competing with their neighbors. They think that that's what it is to be middle class. It's not necessarily because they're worried about security. So I think we need to play around with what people do with walls and what they think they are. The other thing is that we can take it as given, I think, that the more you build walls, the more you're going to produce subterfuge. The more one is, entanglement, conviviality. The more you produce one, the more you're going to produce its opposite. And I've learned that from tracking very closely for a long time the history of apartheid, that the more you officially invoke separation, the more you're going to find a latent history, an underneath history of something else. So, let's think about walls in a complicated way. I think that would be very useful.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think also that walls are quite deadly. The same, as we know, they are they can be deadly, especially in environments where questions of xenophobia, as we witness them in certain moments in Africa, can emerge. But one point on decadence. I don't know how many of you have read the Bible and are aware of the... I guess not many. That's why I'm raising it. But in the Bible, there is this fabulous story about the two cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they are really cities of decadence in all senses of the term. Extremely wealthy city. People committing sins all the time. I'm talking about sins because Lee, in his archaeology of the pagode yesterday, alluded to that. And there were places where, of course, when you went to repent for your sins, and he was wondering, all these things we have now, what sins are we repenting for? And I told it to Sarah, who didn't attend the session, and she said, but they are repenting for the sins of capitalism. Anyway, so a decadent city is, in the biblical mythology, of course, a city where everyone and everybody is busy committing sins. Wealth being, of course, one of those sins. It seems to me that the Parisians would contest your classification of the. They wouldn't place Venice before Paris, by the way. But to be a bit more serious, my feeling is that the question of decay and decadence can be read at least at two levels. One is a purely sociological level. As we see in Johannesburg, you go to the municipality, they will tell you we have 1,200 risky buildings in CBD. They have to, they are in state of decay. They have to be erased. The other one is, of course, introduce an ethical judgment into things. But my feeling is that what we are witnessing right now is a form of decadence that is totally different from the Sodom and Gomorrah model. It's a form of decadence in which cities are understood, let's say city building is equated to a form of scenography. To build a city is what? It's to produce a series of tableaus, which indeed exist as interfaces of other local and faraway places. But local tableaus that are juxtaposed in some kind of urban, you were calling it the other day, junk, urban junk, meaning that you can really displace them, context doesn't mean much, which doesn't mean that they don't have a meaning. So it's the certain form of reconciliation of place and ephemerality. It seems to me that produces decadence. In that sense, decadence doesn't really have a moral meaning at all. It's just this institution of a chain of substitutions, which make it such that, it doesn't really matter whether we are at the Radisson in Shanghai, we could be at some similar place, Vineyard in Cape Town, and place and ephemerality are therefore reconciled, and the discussion you opened yesterday about place and space, in fact, is abolished, doesn't exist any longer. The moment that doesn't exist any longer, you have opened the door for postmodern forms of decadence.
I have talked, it keeps to come back up why Western theory to study this eastern cities. I would like to propose that the problem is really not and should not be Western or non-Western theory, but that we need a model of theory, and perhaps a new model of theory that is responsive to emergent phenomena rather than applying the preconceived categories derived from earlier cultural parameters. And this is something this is how I understand something Akbar brought into the discussion when he talks about poor theory. It's a theory that gives priority to the object and looks at the object as something strange and not yet understood, and where the priority of the theory can lead to finding new theoretical parameters that are not alternative to Western theory, but change and transform Western theory from within. We could even see it along the lines of Sarah's reflections as reanimating theory in a very similar way, looking at concrete living conditions and so on. And I perhaps as an example, if I think about Achille's phrase, every city has its other, and very often we see what João Bill called zones of abandonment as the other of the cities, and that is refugee camps, slum cities, shadow cities, and so on. One thing, if we look at the living conditions there and the affects that are the cultures of affect and conviviality that are produced, we can often see that they are more alive than the modes of conviviality that we find in the walled-in communities, the so-called gated communities, or the aseptic cities that are labeled the best. Irvine, where we come from, has been labeled the best designed city in the world. The modes of conviviality are really diminished because of certain exclusions. And the one thing about the Berlin Wall was that it was a wall that was built to keep people in. And the walls that have been built since are mostly walls to keep people out. And that kind of dynamic and the production of dead zones in the highly over-designed places and over-planned places. This is something I think could be relevant also to how we think about critical theory.
Thank you. The last time I looked at Irvine, I missed the city. Other questions from, yeah.
I am Annalisa from University of Milan, and I have a couple of points.
It's hard to, can you?
Yeah, first that probably if the more cities become modern, then the more they seem decadent, you said. Well, probably to me, this is an evidence of the fact that we are not modern anymore, or probably have never been. Second point, please let me recall Umberto Eco's notion of kitsch, as far as to Achille said about the fact that we are forced to read the aesthetic of capitalist cities. Umberto Eco defines the kitsch exactly as a form of very forcing, very strict meanings embedded into design object, as very strong and deterministic pattern of interpretation. So that could be an interesting point. And third, as to the wall in the city, Probably another layer to create wall in the city is using ICT. For example, in crime mapping, which has become actually technologies of diversity mapping. It's exactly a way to create invisible walls in the city.
When we're talking about decay, I just want to add a little note about decadence. I think we might be critical of decadence, but I don't know that that's a local planning value. In walking around the city, you see the big yellow on red signs, character signs, that warn against the decay of the poorest and most sort of densely populated parts of the city, that say warning against fire, warning against drugs, warning against crime, which I think decay is a political value that's being used. Yesterday, there was a comment about the Siheyuan and how those people who were living there were letting it decay, which was not something I necessarily saw from that movie, but I think that was a comment on not the physical state of the infrastructure, really, but on the people who live there, just the way that decay is being used now as a kind of critique, not of the actual city's state, the state of the city, but rather of the people who were there. Just a footnote.
Jason.
Well, it's more a comment than a question. Well, I think one question that floating around is what can we understand? What can we understand? What can we understand cities or life through design today, right? Well, I guess for that question, we cannot take the word design too literally. If we take the word design too literally, then we would think, who designed something and what is a good design, what is a bad design. And I think that is a quite wrong approach to the question. If we look at a city today, if you think this city is well designed or is bad designed, then we no longer ask the question, what made that design happen? And what is the historical or cultural background that lead to that can be good or can be bad design? And another way to understand the word design is, well, if say, Roland Barthes teach us something, it is called the death of the author. Then probably we can learn something, is that what will be the death of the designer? Because for building, it's not the design that can control everything. The user, the end user, the one who live, the inhabitants, they also design how they use the building. So I think the word design is not a kind of one-way street. It is a multiple collaboration process that we all design. So it's not just what Achille called, is design from the low. From probably it can be what can be called a design from the mass. It's a democratic process that is not from the top that designer design everything, but it's how we use it and how we redesign it. So I think, and when you talk about design concept, it's more kind of about this kind of multiple dimension rather than this top-down direction thing.
What I found really inspiring in all the three talks was the question of linking the question of design and designing the city to a question of an ethics of relationality. And I think that's a really interesting turn in terms of we can of course read a global city always as a kind of symptom of a relationality on a global level gone wrong, right? As a kind of maybe mirroring of a global situation, and at the same time as a kind of negative reaction to, for example, global flows in the creation of walls, gated communities, etc. But if we, I think, as Achille suggested, if we sort of like turn this paradigm round and think about how to design a city in order to give a kind of model of a global relationality that would be ethical, I think that's a really interesting point, and I wondered if you had more to say, or any of you had more to say about it. I think that would also get us away from an idea of focusing on the past, so the symptom, right? But focusing, as Sarah has suggested, on the moment of production, right? And on the moment of creativity. And one question I have, of course, if we think of an ethics of relationality through the city, Achille has underlined that the sort of like walling off in the city is paradoxical to the idea of city itself, then I think we have to think about why we are abandoning another term, not only the urban, but also the question of community, right? Where in a way the idea of relationality before was always the nostalgia of the kind of naturally grown community, right? Where we're now thinking about maybe also a nostalgic vision of a modern or maybe modernizing city.
Just a quick comment on this stuff on decadence is going around. I think the one distinction we can make is that usually we think about decadence in terms of decay, but also in terms of the seductiveness of decay. I mean, it's that double. But what we're seeing today in a lot of the phenomena we're talking about is not so much the decadence of the old, but the decadence of the new. Right? Something that's new and something that's in fact surging, which is already a form of decadence. And one example, and I'll stop there, is the example given, I think, by about Mumbai, Indian cities, where in the midst of overpopulation, you have these as well investment housing, which are like unpopulated. So you have these sort of, in the midst of overpopulation, you have these empty houses. That's a kind of image of what that is.
Okay, we'll take the last few minutes of this morning's session to let the panel respond.
I want to ask, how do you consider art and image making of this decadence and the urban transformation? Because if you think about China, the new media, contemporary Chinese independent documentaries and fiction films, including Jia Zhangke's The Still Life.
Can you speak up, please?
The Still Life, talking about the ruins, destruction in Three Gorges Dam, and rebuilding the new city without historical attachment to this place. And yesterday I went to a studio. We also saw a photograph. There's an arc, very old arc in front of the ruins. So at this moment, the arc has been preserved by the photograph, but we know it doesn't exist anymore. So I think we should also think about the representation of the city image and the transformation.
We could continue hearing from the floor for a few minutes, otherwise we'll take a break.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to thank you for your comments. I got a great deal from them, so I don't want it to end like that. And I think it's 10:25, and it would be a great place to end, actually. But
okay.
Yeah.
We'll take a break, reconvene in groups at about 5 of 11. Thank you.